Hey, everybody. Let me just make sure. Let's see. Jimena, can you see if the table is showing well? Because I think I have to zoom a little bit in.
Yeah, 1 second. There you are.
Okay, guys, just one moment. Let me just make sure this is right so you guys can see better. Oh, it's not letting me fix the size.
It looks good though. So it looks good.
It's okay? Okay, so hi everybody. I know some of you might expect to see beautiful Kali here, but I am here for you today. I'm so happy. My name is Julia Perugini. If you guys don't know me yet, nice to meet you. So I have an Instagram account called Julia's Cookies AZ, and I'm so happy to be here today. Super excited. And I want to know where you guys are speaking from. If you guys want to put in the chat where you're coming from, if you have any questions. And I think we can get into it right away. So, but just a little bit of, let me see if I can zoom this in. It's not letting me zoom in a little bit more, but I think you guys can see. If you guys can see very well, just let us know. But I think it's clear enough, right? Okay, yeah. Renee says it's clear, she can see. So just a little bit background. So I work with America's Craft, and I also have been in contests and Food Networking, a couple of shows. I do a lot of Amazon ads and little videos for companies. And I'm so glad. It was a dream of mine to be here in Michael's, and I'm so happy. So let me show you guys. I think you guys already know what we're gonna do. So this is the cookie cutter that we're gonna work with today. And we have the beautiful version of the snow globe that, Kali created. And also, I'm going to introduce a very new one, which, Igloo, that is made with the same cookie cutter. So, so we're going to start with this one, and then we're going to go to the next cookie, which is going to be the little Igloo. I guess so far, I always like to show, steps so you guys can understand the depth of the cookie and the layers that we're gonna work with. And if you guys, like I say, if you guys have any questions, let me know. And so we're gonna move along with this first one. So you guys probably saw the list of materials that we need for this class. So we're gonna use this stackable, and the little snowman is gonna be made of this cookie, which I already have here. Also, if you don't have, if you forgot, if you haven't made or don't want to make a little cookie like that, you could also use just to design the little snowman on top of the cookie once it's dry. So I rather do like this because I think it looks so much cute in 3D, but is options there. So let's start for the beginning. For the beginning, we're gonna need the cookie. I have sugar cookie, but I love working with gingerbread. I just don't have any gingerbread ready today, so I'll be working with a sugar cookie, but gingerbread cookie work as well. The first step for this cookie, I believe the best way to start would be with the blue and the white lines. And you can see why. I explained that what happened is you wanted this part to be kind of dry before you stack the cookie on it. So let's get the blue. So I have my Sweet Sugarbelle bag with my icing ready. So this icing recipe is gonna be, I think Emily is gonna put on the screen or send to you guys. I'm using, of course, Sweet Sugarbelle icing because it was one of the best that we can find anyway. So I'm gonna start and go around the cookie. So now notice that I'm not so close to the cookie. If you're new in cookie decorating, you gotta practice a little bit on that. But you don't, when you make circles, you don't want to be too close to the cookie, because if you're too close to the cookie, it's actually a little bit more difficult to make the circle. I think my circle didn't come out very well. Let me just do another one because I'm in an awkward position here. But look, I try to keep a little bit of the distance. It's easy for you to get the circle right if you a little bit farther from the cookie itself. Stop the pressure, put it down. Let me get my tool. This one is a very pointy one, but I like this one also from the Sweet Sugarbelle set. And also I have this one here. next step, I'm gonna make sure you have a little, you have a semicircle almost, because you want to have a space between the sky and the snow. So here we're gonna separate like that. Just put a little bit more here. So, and then the next step is gonna be the same circle. It's kind of a semicircle, isn't it? And we're gonna do with the white icing. I'm using tip number 2. 2 or 3 works fine. I don't want to use the number 1, for example, because that way it's gonna be, I think the ice is gonna come out of the cookie line. So, okay, I think that looks okay. Okay, any questions so far? Any questions so far, Jimena?
We do have one here from Mary. What is the name of the stand you have the cookie on?
Oh, yes. This is from, where is the box? I have the box. This is from Sugarbelle. You can find the Michaels. So this is we call the cookie turntable. So you can find that in Michaels. And that's separated in 2 pieces, and then you have the top and the bottom. And it's good because, you know, you can, on your cookie, you don't have to worry about so much of your arms and position that you're working with. So that was a good question. I almost forgot about that. I mean, I forgot actually. So now the next step, blue. And again, it could be a little bit brighter if you want to, but it's winter, so it doesn't have to be too bright of a blue. Because by the way, you guys, can you guys see my shirt, my Snoopy shirt? That's my favorite sweater of all times. It's Christmas sweater, but I can't give up on it. I just love it. And I am in Arizona. It's not that cold even, but I love the sweater. So let's see. So that's gonna be second step. And another thing that I always do, I don't have it here now, but this is a pro tip, okay? Always dry your cookie under the fan. So I have a little fan, which, oh, it fell down. Okay, I'm on it, guys. Sorry. I usually use a little fan, and I dry my cookie over the fan, under the fan. So any little fan, you know, I bought mine at the dollar store maybe. So I just put the fan close to the cookie so it dries shiny, and also help with the process drying itself. So first step, done. Okay, any of you guys are doing with me at the same time, or you guys just watching and gonna do later? Who is doing now? Sometimes we have people doing at the same time when we do those kind of classes. Just curious to know. Okay, so now the next step, it would be using the red icing. And let me just clean my tip. So I'm gonna go from the bottom here. Same thing. We're working with same circles or round edges. So keep your distance. And that's when the turntable comes. Very handy because you see, my hand is not moving. Only the little table. Just touch the edge and done. Okay, so let me just fix this. I don't want any little, you know, pointing up, you know, little sticking up points on the end of the cookie. And now I have no chip on these bags because I don't think you need it. When I'm working with the 2 consistency, which is in this case, I have the stiff consistency that goes around, and I have the more liquid consistency that goes inside the cookie. So this one here, I'm just gonna fill in. And this, if you guys are familiar, this is like probably a 17 seconds ice, which means when you have a peak on this ice, it takes about 17 to 20 seconds to go down. It's not a very liquid icing. I like to work with that icing that is not so liquid for some projects, and I think for this one, it needs to be. It doesn't need to be too liquid. And also, the only thing when you're working with icing that is not very liquid, you kind of gotta go a little fast. If you kneel, maybe you should work with 15 13-second ice. If you have more experience, you can do 17, 20, you know, depends how your level is right now. And also depending on the size of the cookie, right? Because if it's a big cookie and you have a lot of surface to cover, you also don't want to be working with icing that is not enough liquid to give you time to cover the whole thing. So now I'm gonna do the red bottom here. I always start from outside and then I make my way in. And sometimes, and also that is good because if I see that I put too much icing outside, I just not put too much ice in the middle anymore, which happens just now. I put a lot of icing out and I'm just gonna use my tool to make everything smooth. How that looks so far. So step number 1, number 2, and number 3. For me, it's very important to do in this order because you want the stop sheet to be more dry. It's a big space. And also you're gonna put your stackable right there, right? So I wanna make sure this one is a little bit more dry before you do that, okay? So let this little guy stay here for 1 minute. Okay, and now we're gonna do the little snowman. I already have one here that is kind of ready compared to this one, right? And so same thing, you can do 2 ways. You can just go ahead and go around the whole thing because it's gonna have a scarf. So it doesn't make so much of a difference of separate the head. But since I'm so used to do that, I hope you guys can see. I am gonna just do 2 steps like that. Okay, I hope you guys following up. Any questions, guys?
Yeah, we have a question here. Did he use a tip when flooding the blue icing?
No, so when I'm flooding, I'm not using any chip because I just feel like it doesn't need it. I save myself a little bit of washing because I go through a lot of colors every day. So if I feel like it doesn't need to make the line. So when you're making lines, of course, the chip is gonna be the best way because you need kind of be consistent. You can use, I use a lot of, you know, if I'm rushing, and if I'm lazy, I use chipless bags. But what happens is, if you want a consistency, if you want every line to be exactly the same, it's no way to do without the chip because as much as you're good and iron and cut it, you don't know for sure how many millimeters you're cutting there. So that's when the chips come, you know, very handy for you. If you just don't care about that, I mean, it's up to you. But if you want to make sure every line is the same and every line also, you know, have the same, not just the same level of consistency, but also you guarantee that you have enough space to ice and not have the icing overflowing. Because sometimes we make very skinny lines and then the ice comes out because maybe you thought, oh, I caught it, it's about 2 or you know, 2, it's almost like about the chip number 2 or 3, but you don't know for sure. So that's why for the lines, you should use the chip. Sometimes I don't, I'll be honest, but it's because I'm lazy and I shouldn't be, but that's the best way to do. Because, you know, sometimes you don't want to be washing things or you don't have the time or you don't have enough chips, which also is not my problem because I do have chips, but sometimes I got lazy. That's the truth. So now I'm gonna cover this cookie same way, outside in. Okay, if you have any other questions, you can say, you or Emily or, you know, you guys can tell me.
So Deb does have a question. What's the tip size you're using for the white icing right now?
For right now, I'm using 2 for everything.
Perfect. Thank you.
So. Let me see. Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. It's 3. I usually was either 2 or 3. I probably thought it was 2, but it's 3. But either way, 2 or 3 is gonna work fine. Number 1 is too skinny. It's not gonna work. So this little guy, feel like I'm gonna give him a bite, but no, not on camera, right? Just bite-sized cookie. So since this guy is done, and I have one here already ready to finish decorating. So very easy. I just have, for this one, I just have, I'm gonna have the little face. Wait, let me see. I have, and again, we're doing similar to what our Queen Sugarbelle would do. Might be a little bit different, guys, because everybody works a little bit different, and nobody can be as good as she is, right? So let me do my best here. So what she's gonna, what she did is like little eyes. For this one, use a chipless bag, but you can use a number 1 if you want to. Number 1 chip. And for the little mouth, we're gonna have those little dots too. Okay. So far, he looks happy. And so I have here the orange as well. And also, very important thing, if you want to stack those cookies, some people stack them when they're still wet, right? And they're going to stay there. I don't like to do that because I feel like it's pushing my icing out. So when you do on the cookie, let's say this cookie was still wet and I put this guy here, I float my cookie and look very perfect, right? I put the exact amount of ice that I need. And then I put this guy here, he's going to be taking space from the icing, and the icing is going to tend to go outside. So I see a lot of people doing that, and they're, oh, my cookie, the icing is going, it's just overflowed. Because when you icing the cookie, you're not counting on adding something else. The space that's going to take is a lot. So I would first let dry, or if you want to do that, you can, but just make sure you put less ice or use a bigger tip, so you have that space for the icing to move out without getting out of the cookie itself, okay? Right, so now we're gonna make a little scarf for this guy. Oops. And for this scarf, you can do different things, but I'm just gonna do like the same scarf. And that's it. And then we're gonna work on the nose, which is just a little bit orange. If you don't have the orange, you can use the red, I guess, but it should be orange because it's, it's a little carrot, it's supposed to be a little carrot, so that's why. All right, so this one is ready. So now, going back to this cookie here, right? In this one, like I said, the top is dry, but the bottom is not. But we're gonna try to go with the red and do some details now. The piping consistency. Let's go over here.
So Julia, we have a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay, let's go.
First, Erin would like to know how long you should allow cookies to dry before doing additional designs on top of the icing.
Oh, that's a good question. I was going to say it, but I talked too much, I forgot it. Thank you. So what happened is, I would say it depends. Some people have dehydrators. I rather using the fan. So I would say at least, I would like to let wait dry at least 4 hours before do anything else. But depends what you're doing, right? Because if you're going to stack, you're going to add weight to the cookie. So probably, it depends where we live too, because I live in Arizona, everything is dry so fast here. But maybe 6 hours or so before you stack them on here. And special, okay, here we go. If you're gonna pack your cookies, done is a different story, because humidity or any type of liquid is the #1 enemy of icing. The second one is air. So cookies don't like ice, royal icing doesn't like water and air. So if you're gonna pack your cookies, I would say give at least 8 hours under the fan, I would say, to be safe before you come with this little guy and put in here. Because if you do that, you're gonna keep the humidity, the water under this little guy. But the water always gonna find a way out. So when you put in a bag, it's gonna start to be kind of foggy inside, and it might get wet, and your cookie is going to be damaged. So make sure to let dry at least, I would say, 8 hours if you're going to do that for packing. If your cookies are going to be for your house to eat and you're just going to put in a platter, it's going to be open, I think you can get away, be okay with 4 or 5 hours maybe. Yeah, but I would let dry more.
Perfect. And another question here. Is there a good recipe to bake cookies to make sure that the shape that the cookie, when you bake it, it maintains its shape? Or any advice, any tips that you could give for cookies to stay in the same shape they were cut in?
Yeah, sure. So a few things. That is a big question, and a lot of people ask. And for me, what works for me, I mean, number one thing, Sweet Sugarbelle, she has amazing recipes and all kinds of tips on her website. I also have a few on my Instagram, and but I can tell you this. What I think is the most important thing that I do for every single cookie. If I do royal icing cookies, sugar cookies, alfajors, whatever I do, I always freeze my cookies. So I roll my cookie dough and I cut the shape and I freeze on the shape already. I never freeze my dough to roll again because it's just extra work that I don't need. Thank you. I already have a lot. So I just freeze my cookies on the shape. So I roll the dough, cut the shape, right? Cut the shape, and then I take the extra dough and I freeze everything on the shape that is gonna be. And I freeze at least, that's me, okay? I freeze for at least 8 hours. I usually rather freeze overnight. And then I'm gonna bake at 375. So I know it's high, but there's a reason for that. If you guys wanna know, I can tell you. Who wants to know why? That's the science of it. Okay, so here you go. Nobody say they want to know. Rina, nobody wants to know. I'm just joking. I'm gonna tell anyway.
Everyone wants to know.
So what happened is the cookies have liquid part and have the butter and also have some baking powder or baking soda, right? Most recipes. What happened is if you bake your cookie at 350, most chance that you have is to heat up the whole cookie. You're gonna heat up the whole cookie probably in a similar temperature. When we do a 375, you are actually baking the edges of the cookie before you bake the middle of the cookie. So that will not give time to the cookie to spread. The edges are gonna be baked first, they're gonna get stable, and by the time that the heat gets to the middle, the edges are stable, it's not gonna expand on you. So that is the number one thing that I learned. Nobody told me that. I keep trying so many times because I was having the problem in the beginning, like everybody has, why my cookie doesn't stay in shape? Now, if you do that, if you freeze your cookie on the shape, and if you bake in high temperature, so you kind of start baking outside before the middle, you're not gonna have any spread ever again. Let me know, guys. Let me know if you do it and it works. Let me know, because everybody who try it, everybody goes, oh, and you're right, it never spreads. So that's the free tip of the day. You're welcome. So now we're done with the first cookie pretty much, right? So what is left for us to do now is stack this little cute guy. And how we do that? You can just, I seen people do interactive cookies, and imagine how cute. You make 2 of those. Oh my God, I have an idea for Valentine's. I'm gonna do it. Just make a little boy, a little girl, and and just let them like this in a package, and they can put themselves. Oh, that's a cute idea. I'm gonna do it. Okay, let's go back. Not sidetrack too much. So just gonna put a little bit of icing and just drop him there. And I love it how 3D that looks like. Oops, I messed up in my cookie here because completely dry. Oops, that's me. Get used to it, guys. I messed up a lot, so because I just get too excited. How is that? Isn't it cute? All right, so this is the first guy, but I love that idea that I just had of putting 2 guys there. I might just do this one now. Let's do this one. Just one moment, okay? Let me just, because why not? This is live anyway, and I already talk a lot all the time, like I say. Any more questions? What I'm doing this last minute idea?
No, but we have a suggestion to add snowflakes.
Yes, the snowflakes. Well, when I look we have two ways to add the snowflakes. So either we can do like little dots. We can use these little sprinkles, which is easy. If the cookie is wet, we can do that. We can even try this one and see how it looks. Or you can buy sprinkles, which I have somewhere in this big wall of things. And I think I can get one. And then do like Sweet Sugarbelle did, just put a little snowflake in the corner and a little holly over there. So those are all good ideas that we can do. So when I do snow globes, I usually put a bunch of snow. Oh my goodness, there's so many of them. Okay, I know. It's just not necessary, but I think they look good together. Nobody wants to be alone. Come on, guys. Now is a couple of snowman for you. Happy family. Okay, so let's do this one very quick. Do we have time? How we are on time? Are we good? Because I'm gonna make some snow here.
Yeah, we're good. You still have 30 minutes.
Oh, great. And then if it comes any other questions, no, let's go over this one. This one was kind of quick because I want to show you this. So if you have sanding sugar, that looks so cute as snow. But also, I love those little, I don't know, they call sprinkles. Because look, you can just add some there like that before you get your snowman there when it's wet still, and just let dry like this. That's what I did with my last, I think my last snowman video, that's what I did. See? And then, I don't know if you guys can see because maybe my light is too bright sometimes. Right? And let's be honest, save you time, you know? You can get your nails done because you don't have to spend 15 hours doing little snowflakes. So that is another idea. Another one, just one moment. I know it's a little awkward, but I'm gonna do this because at this point, you guys already know that I'm not too conventional. So I'm sorry, guys, but look at this. These little snowflakes that you can find. And this, I think I got in Michael's this mix, but I don't remember who makes it. But you can also get some snowflakes from your sprinkle mix and just adding some, here and there. And that's what the pictures that you see on the website. So Sugarbelle put one in a little corner and she put a little holly in there. Okay, so that's what I'm gonna do. And that's another saving time thing, that you can do. So you can get your nails done. I'm just joking, you have to get your nails done. So next thing is another idea that I just want to let you guys know. If someone, okay, who not yet very familiar with the consistency of icing, you can also work with one consistency ice, okay? So the piping consistency is the easiest because you don't have to learn all the process of how many seconds the ice is, how stiff or not. So let's say if you just wanna work with one consistency, I would get stiff icing and I would just do this. I love how the zigzag method look. Can you guys see it? And you just keep going. So this is a beginner's technique that doesn't look like a beginner technique, to be honest. I still use a lot of this for details. And let's say if you don't have two consistency icing or you don't really want to work with two or don't have the time, it looks kind of cute, doesn't it? So you can do that for the whole cookie if you want. So let's just do the second part just since we start with this vibe here.
So Julia, we have a couple Of questions. What brand of coloring do you use for the icing?
Well, it depends. So I have some that is from America's Craft. I have some that I do have some that is for Wilton. I have some for Ann Clark. I have some for Chef Master. It depends, you know. So I would say in general, a lot of those the colors are good. I would try to stay with the ones that are made in US. But you know, we have a lot of very good colors. I can't pick one for you and tell you because it depends. Here I'm using different mix, like the red. Probably this red is from Chef Master. The blue that I'm using, I think I just got the airbrush from Switch to Fairy, I believe, and I just added because I just need a very light color. So yeah, so I have a few different ones that I use. I'm not too picky with colors because I usually mix them to create the shades that I like. So I hope that answers. You have more questions? Okay, so this is how it would look like. Let's see if I can show. Any more questions, Rina? Rina, I'm sorry. Let me just get this. You can see my teeth. Okay, so now I think we're good with these cookies. What do you guys think? Any questions about this project that we just did? Because I have to show the next one. So this was you know what we just finished. And so I want to show the igloo now.
So we did have one last question. The bag where you put the icing, are they just smaller sizes or did you cut them down?
This one's a sweet Sugarbelle, so they made for icing. So they small, because if you get, some bags are big, that is a good question, because some bags you see are big because they're usually for cake decorating. For icing, you want a small bag that fits in your hand, so you have more hand control. And of course, with Sugarbelle, they know what they're doing, so they already give a bag that is good in size. It comes with line. Let me see, I have it here. So it comes with the line, so you know where you should go. See the fill line? Because anything over more than that, guys, it usually is too much pressure in your hand and it's gonna hurt at the end of the day. So you don't want a lot of icing, number one, because doesn't give you precision. Number two, you save your hand. You don't want to go to physical therapy because too much cookies, too much ice in your bag in a few years. Because that happens, if you have too much icing, this is going to start hurting. So this is a perfect size. Right. Okay, now I'm so excited about this one because I never seen that before. I mean, we always trying to shape shift, right? Use the cookie cutters, and so Sugarbelle is a queen of shape shifting. I don't know how she's made, but she have ideas that nobody ever had. So, but I had this one today. That's a cute one. So trying to create something using the same cookie cutter and winter. So I thought that this was going to be a easy and cute project. So the steps, first step is the line and the door, right? And then also you can make the door like black if you want to make sure like shows like it's dark inside, you could do that. But I made blue. So this cookie, the technique that I used to make this cookie is just the same that I used to make corn. Have you guys made corn before? I use like the different kind of colors and just add the little things that can be the corns. This one is gonna be like the little pieces of icing that makes the igloo. Is that how you say igloo? I don't know, guys. Yeah, I have this heavy accent if you guys didn't notice it. So sometimes some words can come a little funny, which is okay. Okay, guys, but I think this one was okay. Igloo, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you. You guys probably think, oh, this cookie lady is a little bit strange. Oh my goodness, what is my, okay, there he goes. I lost my little cleaning paper. That's another thing. Always I have with me a little bottle of water and some paper towels to clean the chips because you don't want nothing dried on the chips. So for this one, okay, let me just do the first pattern. We're gonna make it a line. And then again, our turning table comes handy for the circle because the bag doesn't have to move. Just the turning table turns around. So now, kind of, you can go ahead if you still like feel not comfortable, just making the door. You can get your pen and just kind of trace a little bit. With your edible marker. That you also can find at Michael's. This one's with Sugarbelle as well. I usually don't, at this point, I've been doing cookies for so long that I go for it. And that's another thing about cookies. I feel like it's okay sometimes to make a mistake, just do over again, Eventually you don't make a mistake anymore as often. Unless if you make, because sometimes I still make mistakes that I go, how I didn't do this again? And then I remember that I have done wrong again before and I keep doing. But this one is an easy one, right? But if you need help, you can always get a small cookie cutter or even a piping chip that is the bigger ones for icing, for buttercream, and just have a circle that helps you, whatever works. So this is the first step. Now, next thing, I'm going to start making the little, what's that called? The little piece of icing is called bricks, right? Like kind of bricks. I don't know. You guys can help me with that.
Yeah,
bricks, right?
yeah.
I don't know if there's ice bricks. That's a thing. I don't know. Anybody for Alaska?
I don't know. I don't know if they have another special name, but bricks works.
Bricks works for us, right? Okay, so I'm gonna make like this. So all you do is put your chip somewhere in a cookie, just starting pressure, 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 and this is of course the icing that is the stiff. Okay, and if you wanna fix the little edges, you fix it and just make them random. Don't make them all together. You want to make them randomly like that. See? Just randomly. And I did with blue, the next color. Because you want to, yeah?
Julie, Les is asking if we can have a close-up. I know that we're having difficulties with like zooming in, but could you maybe bring back the camera a little bit?
Yeah, let me try and see if you let me do it now. Because we did before, right? Before starting. And
yeah, it was working great.
It was very close. And I don't know, is this being the number one camera now? You guys can enjoy the view of my Snoopy. Let me see. Yeah, that's so strange because before, let me just turn the camera and come on back. Oh, here we go. I have to just like turn everything back in. Is that a little better?
That's better. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. I don't know what happened because it was like super close. I can even try to put a little close if you want. Well, that's better way. Good?
That's better. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm gonna just keep doing some random bricks. And then go to the next color. Okay, let me just clean my tip here a little bit. It's awful when it's like dry and so pressure, 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 and stop. Hold pressure, 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 stop. Okay. Let me just turn it around so it's gonna be easier. And it's the same thing, like I say, for corn, right? When fall comes, guys, if you've never done that, just think about get a few colors in the corn the same way. It's the cutest thing. So, let me see. And so eventually, you're gonna cover the whole cookie. The thing is though, I would give a few minutes between one and another so the colors don't start mixing. We lucky that this color is very light, so it's not gonna like bleed, into each other. But if you're making corn in the fall, and then you wanna look maybe using orange or red, the colors like that, maybe you wanna give a little bit more time so they can dry separately before you do that. Okay. And so you're gonna keep going. Oops, this brick came out very weird.
So Julia, how long can the icing be kept in those bags?
So every time that I make let's say if I made a lot of icing, I make as much icing, especially let's say if you're baking an order for customer, different things. If you're making content like I do, making videos, I don't throw my icing away because nobody's gonna eat those cookies, okay? If you're gonna make cookies for orders and for people to eat, I would say not keep in a bag the icing. Just put whatever you want to use it, and I would not save them. I make a bunch of icing in a big container, and I leave refrigerator for about maybe 5 days. And every time that I need, I take a little bit in a little Tupperware and I mix it and I use it. Don't go back, okay? Although the icing nowadays, everybody makes icing with meringue powder, which is safe if it was raw eggs, and then it's a little more complicated. But if it's meringue powder, you can save in the refrigerator for about 5 days. You can freeze for up to 2-3 months. But I would say mix as much as icing that you're going to need for the project that you're working on, so you don't have a lot of leftovers. Unless if you make content, if you're making videos like I do a lot, you just remix the icing and use it, because most of the cookies that I make, sad to say, not all of them get to someone to eat, because by the time that I finish my videos, my products, they old. So unfortunately, that goes to the waste. But if someone's gonna eat, don't let on a bag outside of the fridge. I would not recommend that, okay? Not safe.
So Julia, a couple of requests. So someone is asking if you could maybe bring the cookie up to the screens for like a real good close-up, just so that we can see the shape.
Let me see if I can do again. I'm sorry, guys, can appreciate my Snoopy one more time. Let me just, if I do that.
Oh, there we go. That's real close. Okay. And also, we have a question about what is it that you're doing with a stick exactly?
With what?
With the little stick, the green stick? When you
okay. Yes. So this what happens if we making, when you pipe the cookie, you use this to move the icing around. So it is a way to move the icing to where you want to go without incorporate too much air. And that's why it's pointed. All those tools are usually, some people call them boo-boo sticks, some people call them, what is that called again? I forgot the name of it, but but all those tools, they are pointed for a reason, because we're trying to not incorporate a lot of air. Remember I say the first enemy of icing is water and the second is air. So when this has many, we use that for many things. So this side we can scrape, let's say I made a line that I didn't like. Example, I'm gonna even scrape this one so you can see I made a line that I don't like. So I can get this part here and just scrape. See? Scrape, 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 come clean, and do again. Even can get a little paper and clean, and it's ready to use again pretty much. And the other side is to move the icing. Also, sometimes you can have bubbles and you can just pop the bubble, the air bubble. You see the air bubble there. You come with this little tool, just remove the air bubble, because we don't want air bubbles on a cookie. In this case here, what I was doing, I was just trying to make less peaks as possible because it's a stiff icing. So it's gonna have those peaks. So I'm just trying to minimize the peaks in that case. I hope that answers.
I think it does. Thank you.
Yay. Okay, so basically this one, we're gonna keep going until you cover the whole cookie. Now, let me this one, you know, I think you guys can get the idea. So the idea is making little, is another way to do that, which is you can get a parchment paper and you can just pipe in those little squares and let it dry completely for a few hours. And then you can remove and with a little tweezer, just adding them to your cookie. If you like very worry about how, you know, the size of the little squares or the size of the little bricks, which I tend to get like that sometimes, and then you might want make lines and then pipe all of them, let them dry, and then you can remove them, do one by one. But if you not have this level of craziness, you can just do like I'm doing now. It's gonna come out cute too. Because I sometimes, depending what I'm doing, I go like, oh my God, they not look all the same. They all different. Like yesterday when I was making this last night, I was like, but they look all different. And then I was like, but it still look cute, right? I mean, you can do two ways. You can go for the cute and practical, or you can go to the perfection, right? It depends on your personality or what you doing that day. So two options there. Okay, so now, is there any other questions about that?
So far, no.
Okay. All right, guys. And just out of curiosity, everybody on here live in the United States, right? Because I think it's only for people in the United States, isn't it? Is that right?
Actually, we get people from all over the world. I don't know
Really?
about today, but
Ooh.
yeah.
I wasn't sure because someone told me she was in Canada and she was trying to get in, so I don't know if she got it. My friend Debbie. I hope she's here. So the next step, you see this is the snow in the bottom. So I'm gonna show you how I did. I did with this little guy here, the little snow balls, I call them, sprinkle thing. So for this one, I wanna make sure I don't want the lines, you know, straight because I wanna make like it's a puddle of snow, if you can call it snow puddle. I don't think so, right? Because it's no water. You got the idea. You got the idea. So I'm just gonna add some icing. It doesn't have to be perfect here because it's gonna be completely covered by our little ball stains, which is called sprinkles. I forget, it's not pearls because pearls shine. This ones are not. Even I forgot the name and I don't have the little bottle, but they have in Michael's, they know everything. You get there, ask the girls or the guys, whoever is there. Okay, so here we go. And you add as much as those little that you want. And see, let me see if I can show closer. Light sometimes it's too bright. And so after you do that, you can let dry a little bit, or you can just keep going. But at the end, you should have the whole extension of the cookie. And I can do that really fast, so you know it might not be as good, but we can finish this, I think. Let me just get a few blues in here. I think the blue looks nice because it gives you a contrast. Not that I never seen blue snow, but we make blue snowflakes, don't we? If you're a baker, you know you used blue snowflakes before. Okay,
So Julia, two things. So Deb did make it and she says hi.
Hi, Deb. She made it. Good.
And also we have a question. Do you add white color to your white icing or do you just apply it as is?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yes. Every icing that is white, I add, a little bit white food coloring. Doesn't matter the brand. For me, white is all white. But I make sure I add white because sugar is not really white. Sugar is kind of yellowish once it dries. So if you make the icing with nothing, and then you make the icing with the white, you're gonna see, because once it dries, it becomes this yellowish, dirty color if you don't add the whitening. So definitely get some whitening. And even sometimes when I use another colors, like light colors, I add a little bit of the whitening as well to make sure, that color is showing properly. So it's gonna be like, for me, think about color scheme, think about using a white paper to paint on it or using a yellowish paper to paint on. So many times I add white in all my icing, especially if I'm doing, like I say, pastel colors or light colors. I do white first and then I come to my colors because I feel like I'm painting on a white canvas instead of yellowish canvas. So if it makes sense. Makes sense? I don't know, but that's how I feel. But sometimes I sometimes think I make stuff up in my head so much, but I think that's that's what I think. Okay, so this one. So yeah, my advice is get some whitening. All right, so I think I'm almost done with this guy here. Like I say, it's not gonna be perfect because I'm trying to rush. I want to show the other part here. So the door, if you look how igloos are. Oh, yeah, this one also not too dry yet. If you look how the igloos are, you're gonna note that the little door always gonna come up. So usually we see igloo cookies on the side, right? You see the circle in the little door. So this one we wanna make sure we give that impression as well. So I'm gonna just make a bigger bump. Again, I would wait this one dry for maybe a couple of hours before I go to the next step. I don't know if he might do. So they also don't get mixed. But since we have not a lot of time, that's basically what you're gonna do. I just wanna show you. I start from outside, pipe until in, from outside, pipe until in. And then you try the best as you can, remove that peak in there. Side, going in. I even thought you can make like some, and I didn't do before, but I might do here now just to show. You can even, if you're doing the top, you can leave some peaks like from the top to the bottom, that is gonna be like the ice maybe dry that way or kind of start melting and dry that way. That would be cute too, especially if you have darker background probably. So I know I have the little spaces in there because usually I do maybe one color, wait dry a little bit more before I go to the next color. But that is how it should looks like. What do you guys think? I think that, and then you can always be extra, right? I like being extra. So you can always make a little animal here, let's say a little, if you make it a black background, and you can make a little polar bear inside. Oh my God. Yeah, give yourself a lot of work. Because it looks cute, you gotta do it, right? I mean, sometimes, like I say, save time if you can, but some things are just cute that you can't just let pass, right? Yeah, I think that's it, guys. I think that's what we have for today. Let me just get those two guys together here. Oh, three guys, because this one I didn't put, I should put this snowman in this little guy too. He's so sad all alone, right? Just very quickly. Just one moment. I have this snowman here because I made extra Let me just make this one so happy because he's all alone. I say nobody should be alone, and this guy's alone here. Oh. So let me just do this. And if you guys have any questions, you can always reach me out in on my my Instagram, which is Julia's Cookies AZ, Julia's with S, Cookies with SAZ. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I think the girls, Emily and Rimena, they sent some things for you guys in the chat. You guys should have more information. But if you need me, I'd be happy to always answer any questions. And here we are with our snowman and our snow globe in our igloo. Yay, I think we did. Guys, if you do it, can you send me pictures, please, please, please? I want to see it. And use the hashtags. What is the hashtags again, girls?
Those are Make It with Michael's classes, Sweet Sugarbelle, and AC Food Crafting. I will put it in the chat one more time.
Yes, yes. We want to see what you guys doing. And yes, I think I am done. If you guys have any questions, any last minute questions, I'd be happy to answer. If not, I let Michael take over.
Everybody's just saying thank you so much. Super adorable. Everyone loved this class. So thank you so much, Julia, for an amazing class. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll see you next class. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.